Welcome to episode 7 of Surviving Opioids Beyond an Epidemic podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Simone. On this show, we talk about opioid addiction and we talk recovery. The guests are all folks who have direct personal experience into the crisis. They've researched addiction, work in the therapeutic setting, some who have lost family members, and others who have personally lived through their own experience and are now thriving on the other side of the chaos. This show is for anyone who wants to know that although there's been a lot of tragedy, there's also a lot of hope. On today's episode, we have John and Jude Trang. They are opioid addiction prevention and recovery advocates, and Jude is the author of Opiate Nation, a memoir of love, loss, and acceptance, a book she wrote following the death of her son John to a heroin overdose. They speak all over the world and have a powerful message directed towards families, friends, and policymakers involved with the opioid epidemic. This was a great conversation, and I hope you get as much out of it as I did. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to Surviving Opioids Beyond an Epidemic podcast, where we talk all things opioid addiction and recovery. So opioid addiction has been one of the major public health crises of our lifetime. Most people are aware of that. And despite the increased attention and resources, by a lot of accounts, the problem continues to get worse. This past year, we lost 93,000 people to drug overdoses in the U.S. alone, which is the most in recorded history. We just honored International Overdose Awareness Day this past week. So for today's show, I have two guests, John and Jude Trang. You just heard their bios, and they understand and can speak to this situation as well as anybody. They lost their son John to a heroin overdose in 2014 at the age of 25, and now they're both very active in their advocacy work for opioid addiction and recovery. Jude's the author of the book Opiate Nation, a memoir of love, loss, and acceptance, and they're both very, very passionate about this subject matter, which I'm sure you'll be able to tell once they get going here. So John and Jude, thank you guys for coming on the show. I know you're in Australia, so it's a little bit tricky with the scheduling.
Yep, it's we're here because our only surviving daughter married an Aussie in Arizona, and he wanted to move back, and so they had our granddaughters here, and so there's a magnet, and we're always back and forth. And right now, we've been here since COVID broke out in March of 2020. We were on the last flight that got into the country, and they wanted us to stay, and it was a lot safer here that year. So we're here for a while. And involved in the Rethink Addiction campaign here that is trying to get government policies to be more aware of what's actually happening on the street. These have been more meth addiction. They had an opioid crisis in the 90s. A heroin crisis that took out. I think from what I've heard, that really scared a lot of people away from trying to, think of even using heroin. And their supply chain is different because they're this big island continent. But anyway, we're here trying to, while we're here, we can have a foot on each continent and do what we can.
Well, that's great. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate both of you guys showing up here, because I know it's 7 o'clock in the morning your time. So I'll kind of jump right into it. Jude, you published your book 2 years ago, and full transparency, even though I talk about opioids and addiction all day long, I still never feel fully comfortable speaking to the parent of a child who passed from overdose about that experience. I do it. But I never feel, quite comfortable with approaching the subject. So I'm kind of throwing that out there right from the beginning. But I know that you speak all over the world about this experience. So I'm going to be talking to you here, not as somebody who's in the early grieving stages, as some may be, but as somebody who's been doing the work to process the event. So that being said, can you just talk a little bit about John, a little bit about the story behind the book?
Yeah, I look at this and one thing that comes to my mind is that, growing up in the 50s, 60s, we were the typical Americans. We never took pain medicine. Our parents would have never thought to give us pain medicine for anything. They knew that, you could deal with pain and you'd get through it and it would build your character. Come along the 90s and the fifth vital sign was declared pain. And so then everything we could do in America to alleviate pain. And it's true that severe pain can keep you from being healed, and especially for end of life people with cancer, HIV. But what happened was the opportunists, particularly Purdue Pharma, and many of those things came along and decided they could make billions, which they did. And so even though physicians knew that opioids were dangerous, there was this false narrative that said, if you take opioids when you're in pain, you can't get addicted. Up until a few years ago, that's what we heard friends who were litigating say this. Oh yeah, you can't get it. And we said, absolutely false. That was the false narrative. And so, we found that in our history also that we being a much more indulgent generation of parents, didn't want our kids to suffer pain, not remembering that that was part of character building. And so our kids were much more used to taking pills right from the get-go.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit of a history. Our son, JL, was a typical second child boy. And I think John can tell you a little bit about him.
Well, one of the ways that I've dealt with this loss, which we can talk about in more detail later, is to talk about my son, because he was a fantastic kid. He was a great young man. Little too smart for his own good, probably very, very intelligent, thought he could deal with everything in his mind. I actually take responsibility for early alcohol consumption, which is a factor, and I deeply regret, as along with many other things that you'll hear about probably during this next hour. I was raised with no alcohol as a kid, and Jude's family is Italian, and we started visiting Italy, and oh my word, they actually make their own white wine there, and all the kids have it at lunchtime and dinner time, and that was just the normal. So JL probably had his first alcohol when he was around 12 on one of our trips to Europe. And then shortly thereafter, we moved him from a private school into a public school. We went from 12 kids to 700 kids and felt completely isolated and alone. Got connected with a couple of kids who were kind of outsiders as well. And they, again, began to experience the things that you do in middle school. And so he had alcohol as his first entree into drug use. By the time he was 14, he was using OxyContin with a buddy who, there's a long story there that I don't have time to go into now, but that led then to a very, very serious encounter with something called BT heroin. Black tar heroin was coming up out of Mexico. Tucson was a corridor for it. And they were marketing it, and Jude will probably go into this in a little while, marketing it to the affluent communities. It was something that the older kids at the parties were smoking over in the corner, and JL and his buddies go, hey, well, they're just smoking something. It can't be that bad. And so by the time he was 16, he was not completely, he was heavily involved and addicted to heroin. Jude discovered this graciously, and we were able to intervene. He had 2 healthy years in the last 2 years of high school, between 16 and 18. Had a bad fall in his freshman year of university. Once again, the docs gave him opiates for the pain. And the next 5 years were simply a very hard story of recovery, relapse, in and out of sober living and opiate recovery programs. And let me see, after 6 months of really squeaky clean sobriety, which we consider to be a gift to us from him. In the spring of 14, he had oral surgery, once again had opiates, covered the use at the sober living house he was in. The first night he spent at a new apartment after 6 months in sober living and 6 months of beautiful, wonderful sobriety. He drank heavily, and we got a knock on the door the next morning. And the sheriff said, are you John Trang? And is your son John Trang? I'm sorry to inform you, but he has died. And one of the chapters in the book is saying goodbye in a body bag, because that's exactly what happened then in the next several hours. So I don't know.
Well, that's the nutshell. Jeff, I'm sure you've heard of Dreamland by Sam Quinones, and he
have it right back there
on your shelf.
Yeah, that's right there.
Sadly, it came out the year after JL died, and the NBC News thing that the opioid epidemic came out the year after, and so there was not much information out, in those from the OOs up until around that time in the mid
2014. This was you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of right as, I guess, was that right before fentanyl maybe started to kind of make the headlines?
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
Sort of right before that. Yeah.
We knew about fentanyl because we had kind of our ear to the ground at this point about all things addiction. And so we did have them go back, and when they did the autopsy, and redo the test to see if there was fentanyl in his heroin. And by this time he transitioned from smoking to IV heroin. So he was found slumped over, sitting on the side of his bed with the needle in his vein. He died instantly. And the report was that he had very strong, very potent heroin. And so it wasn't his first use after recovery. They showed that he had been using it while he was taking the Percocet. He used it 5 or so times. So it was the potency. And of course, what's happened is that the drug supply has become completely unstable, even more so now with fentanyl. Yeah. So, he just, along with the alcohol he'd consumed, that was it. And why I brought up Dreamland was that I really think Sam got the picture by saying that our affluent society, our avoidance of pain, and our lack of community made a void that the drugs poured into. And it wasn't like the drugs came into the 50s or 60s, even if you'd had this chain of supply of heroin coming up out of Mexico and cheap, it wouldn't have had the effect it had, because society was more cohesive, right? And I know we don't need to go into a lot of drug stuff because you talk about a lot of the facts about drugs on your show, but you know that now we use 98% Americans of the world's hydrocodone. And so prescription opiates are, heroin prep school. That's what, they called it. His high school, his affluent high school, we found out later because nobody was talking. There had been overdose deaths, there was a drug bust, and nobody said a word. Yeah. And so we didn't know what was out there. And, past misuse of prescription opioids is the biggest risk factor for heroin abuse. I mean, that's just logical. You have to move on and it was delivered to a school, easier to get and cheaper than alcohol. Just because it was so readily available. And so, that's our story.
Well, a final thought on that too, is that really we feel that there are two types of opiate epidemic in the States in particular, and probably here in Australia as well. But traditionally, you had a small group of people, musicians and actors and so on in the 50s and 60s who had the availability to get heroin. It was only available from Afghanistan or, the white powder stuff that they would, so it was only an injectable. And as Jude mentioned, it had an incredible stigma associated with it, and nobody else ever even messed with it. Well, with the advent of now fentanyl, but before that, black tar. The marketing to the affluent communities in America is just incredible. And it's a different facet of the opioid addiction than the pill mill issues going on in the central part of the country.
Well, or the Rust Belt, where there's poverty, homelessness, depression. It's really, I do view them as kind of two different epidemics.
A lot of different factors influencing that.
I agree with that. One of the things, thank you for sharing that. One of the things as I was kind of getting, prepared to be talking with you guys, because I do talk about this stuff a lot and I tell my own story a lot. So kind of same thing as I've gone through this stuff myself, I'm able to tell it with a little bit less emotion, of course, than how I used to tell the story. I was a little bit, I want to make sure that, like on these episodes, for example, that I'm holding up talking to somebody who's talking about a child that passed away. I have a 5-year-old son now. I have a 3-year-old daughter. So as I'm kind of hearing that, thinking about them, but what was happening as you were just talking was actually like not what I was expecting, and I had to look away because I felt myself getting super emotional. I'm right around the same age as what John would be. We were born kind of right around the same year. You guys look like my parents. you look very similar to my parents.
She's Italian.
I'm Italian, he's the Norwegian.
Yeah, we're Italian and Irish.
There you go.
You kind of same type of upbringing, same good school district. Same very, very, very similar stuff. I was a black tar heroin user. I was out in California for 6 years. Almost everything that you were saying, and I had I had multiple kind of nearly fatal overdose experiences, and as I'm hearing you talk, a lot of this stuff, a lot of this opioid overdose stuff, it's just a flip of a coin, kind of like who just happens to wake up that next day and then who doesn't, and I'm hearing you talk, thinking like it could so easily be my parents.
Exactly.
So reflecting back 10 years ago, my son got into this. And
yeah.
Listen, man, one of the beautiful things that came about as Jude was writing the book, we got connected with a lot of our son's good friends, really closely connected to them. They just reached out to us and loved us and hugged us and cared for us those first couple of years afterwards. But one young woman actually contributed the story of hope at the end of the book that describes the insights that she gained as she read Opiate Nation about how her addiction, she started when she was 12, I think, something like that, how that her life actually was influencing her parents. And what it was to hear
it from another set of parents instead of your own.
A twist that she hadn't had. So.
Yeah.
But we could spend a lot of time crying here, man, because it's 7 years. John Leif would have been 32 this year. And there's so much that we wish we'd done differently, it's just one of those things. It's a club that parents do not want to have to join. Yeah. That's the bottom line.
One thing that's gotten like a lot of attention the past couple of years is trauma. Whether that's big T type of trauma, that most people think about. Maybe it's like little T, like developmental childhood kind of stuff that that isn't as quickly diagnosed, but that still tends to just to wreak havoc on somebody's life from one degree to another. I talk about that a lot. One thing that I'm always sensitive about talking about like developmental traumas is doing it like in such a way that it doesn't come across that I'm like accusing the parents of having made mistakes or bad parenting or something like that. So I'm always very, very sensitive to that. But I do think that some kind of developmental issues are at the root of a lot of addictions, of course, not just opioids. Could I ask you guys, how much do you believe that developmental conditions impact addiction development? And do you believe now that there's anything that that parents can do or to focus on in those early years to try to maybe buffer against that risk factor?
Well, Gabor Mate, I agree with his assessment from his world.
Mm.
His world is in Vancouver, British Columbia, is the poverty group with generational poverty, abuse in the home, drug use, alcoholism. And clearly trauma plays a big part.
Mm.
Even though he is clear with his statistics that that's just part of the picture. I think that first window of opportunity that they talk about in childhood is 0 to 3 years, where 90% of our brain is developed.
Yeah.
And even in pregnancy, if moms are abused or they have high stress levels, yes, that can affect your development. I think that the environmental conditions where children grow up is a bigger factor. I also think that genetic predisposition trumps them all.
Mm-hmm.
And, the statistics are that 60% of addiction is attributable to genetic factors.
Yeah.
And I know that from the children, the friends of our son, I talked with a lot of them, because after our son died, everybody was willing to talk.
Mm.
A lot of his friends that used drugs we had never met. Some of them we had, and their stories were that they had all somebody in their family was struggling with alcoholism. In our generation, normally it would have been alcoholism, or the 70s parents, maybe 80s parents would have used pot. But as far as addiction, like for us, we never even drank until the 90s. We just made a commitment not to for many reasons. But if you go back into all four of our parents' backgrounds, there's alcoholism. Some were drop dead alcoholics, some were not. And I don't think that you can discount that. But again, like you, our kid did not grow up in a home with violence, abuse, poverty, addiction, none of that.
Yeah.
So I don't think environment, as far as the nurture part, his greater environment, I think, is a different story, what was happening culturally. And I do think that the second window of opportunity in life is from 9 to 14. And that's the next big burst of brain development. And, you've talked about all the brain chemicals and the different parts of the brain, the frontal lobe, all those things that are those decision area. So the decision area of the brain is not as fully developed. The emotional part of the brain is oversized. And what does that make you do? That makes you take absolutely crazy risks, and your ability to think through problems, your executive function isn't there. So then you put that in with peer pressure and into a society where drugs are easily available. And those risks, instead of seeming as danger, they're seen as enticing, especially for people who are like risk. And I've found that families with addiction like risk.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something about peer pressure?
Well, the thing of it is, our story, as Jude researched for when she was writing, and we realized things like trauma as a factor in drug use. I don't know if you need that for you to hear me or not.
Probably.
Okay. I look back at JL's life, and as Jude said, it just wasn't the kind of thing you'd picture from a traumatic childhood background. Yeah. Although we did place him from this private school into a public school, and as a 7th grader going from Minnesota to Southern Cal and experiencing something similar, I can tell you that's a pretty traumatic experience as a 7th grader. Now, developmentally, was he all done? No, apparently not. There's still this window between 9 and 13. The other traumatic incident in his life was this fall as a freshman in uni. So he actually fell 5 stories off of a parking deck, skittering between two structures, and broke everything.
How old was he at that point?
He was 18, 19, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then, so those 2 instances were clearly traumatic. But yeah, Jude touched on, there's so many factors that contribute to drug addiction. And I think in our son's case, it was that it was the peer pressure associated with feeling isolated, wanting to belong, and the kids that he connected with. And if I was going to say anything to parents regarding where you're going, or you want to save that for later?
Yeah, I'd like to, another book, interestingly, that Gabor Mate wrote with Gordon Neufeld, who was a developmental psychiatrist with children.
Hold on to your kids.
They talk about, that in the olden days or in previous generations, children were adult oriented. They took their cues from the adults in society. Now, and they need attachment. So that's who their attachment was. So they wanted to please and to emulate the adults in their life, their teachers, the people in society. And they're going to get that attachment one way or the other. And if it's not from their parents and trustworthy adults, it's going to be from their peers, which is what's happening now. The modern teenager does rely more on peer acceptance and peer pressure than coming from their parents. And that's dangerous, because then you've got a whole lot of people with underdeveloped brains influencing each other. So anyway,
it's interesting that you bring up that book. I refer people to that book, especially parents. I really have a heart for parents, the young parents in recovery that have like little kids, because there is this myth that to kind of break this generational kind of path of addiction. Well, since I'm abstinent right now, my kids are going to not grow up in a home with active addiction, so that's going to somehow stop the risk factor from getting passed on. And unfortunately, it does not work like that. There's all kinds of other things, and it's not intuitive, especially today in our social media kind of world, with all the devices and the different things that are changing way faster than our ability to research and process what's happening with them. Like this stuff, iPads and all the other kind of stuff, it's been around for a very short period of time. We do not have the research to know exactly what that's doing to all these people. I point a lot of people to that book. That book is incredible. Gordon Neufeld and like Gabor Mate have incredible lectures on YouTube where specifically Gordon Neufeld, as he talks about like the attachment theory. I agree with you. I think that is a gigantic piece of what's going on. When you do attach to the peer group, now it is a game of like Russian roulette, because some peers do develop well, and those attachments, even though it should be with the adult, that you can kind of get away with it a little bit if those kids trend down the right path, so to speak. But if you get paired up with somebody that and then there's some kind of like severing activity that goes on, so some kind of abandonment or like major rejection to this person that you are attached to, that is like, say 30 years ago, for example, if we were majorly attached, or even 40 years ago to the adult. Well, if there was a severing of the adult-child attachment relationship, that was going to be very, very traumatic. But now, as more and more children are attached to the peer group, the likelihood that the peer, this underdeveloped mind of the peer is going to do something that will trigger those same attachment wounds, betrayal wounds. A lot of this stuff happened with me. It's there, and that stuff is very, very hard to get over. Very hard to get over. Whether that's like a romantic partner or just a friendship partner, whatever it is, however you got reattached. So I love that you brought up that book.
Well, and a word for parents listening in. One of our regrets is that we did not engage ourselves more in the whole public community that John Leif was a part of. We weren't connected much to any of the folks at his school, a couple of families, but not many. We weren't connected. We weren't close. We weren't closely enough connected to a lot of the kids that he was hanging out with and to their families. Right. It just wasn't part of the affluent foothills community in Tucson. You're on acre lots or 3-acre lots, and you're not in a neighborhood per se. So my encouragement to parents would be, take the time to know exactly who your kids are hanging out with, what their families are like, what the school is like, what is being done and what's not being done.
Because that peer pressure for our son was, we didn't know that the young man that he spent a lot of time with, John, took them out paintballing and dirt bike riding. We didn't know at the time that his father was in a white collar prison for being one of the big drug dealers in Tucson. And that's where JL started using oxys, was with him before school. So I think that that peer pressure, like you said, the attachment, we've got friends whose kids went to the same school. They came out, they're perfectly fine. They never had anything to do with drugs, but they ran with a different crowd. And so that's really important.
Well, in terms of risk factors as well, age at first use, I mean, there's all kinds of things that can come up in the context of how does trauma influence drug addiction. So yeah, I'll let you guys go.
No, that's great. That's great. And I say it a lot, like when you take a situation like the opioid epidemic, opioid addiction, where there's a problem with a huge incidence and very low long-term success rate, you're inevitably going to get all kinds of arguments and disagreements with regards to what to do about it. And one of those areas is around the caregivers, like you guys are kind of like alluding to, what's considered enabling versus tough love, compassion versus codependency, stuff like that. Looking back on those years, okay, you said John was first using black tar heroin like around age 16. So for those 9 years, what would you suggest to a parent who finds out that their kid is getting into heroin or painkillers? Like if you could go back to when you first found him with it, would you do anything differently, or do you think that the train was already in motion?
We were stunned, and I, again, as a pharmaceutical scientist and as a pharmacist, I knew that heroin was bad stuff.
Yeah.
So for me, another regret, I just did not take it seriously enough. I thought, well, this cannot possibly be. I mean, yeah, he's smoking this black tar heroin, but so the thing that I would encourage parents to do is get the education that you need to understand exactly what's going on. Listen to the professionals, the guys like yourself, the other folks that are running rehab facilities and care facilities. They have studied this stuff. They know it. We, a university professor and blah, blah, I should have known it. I should have been right on top of it and said, holy cow, this is big time freaking serious. We're going to straighten this out right now. We went to an outpatient program that was very, very good. We should have been on, what do they call it? Not an inpatient. It should have been a much more intensive outpatient program. We did the lightweight version.
Okay.
Now, he ended up being sober for 2 years and the designated driver and all that good stuff.
Sober.
And we thought we were out of the woods. Yeah, well, he was still drinking a lot. Yeah.
He was still drinking.
Exactly.
And I say that he, along with many of almost every one of his friends, they were alcoholics first.
Yeah.
And then they were drug users.
Yeah. The other things, aside from the education and seeking and taking professional advice, we had professional advice. We didn't listen to it all the time. We thought we knew better.
Well, and our son would talk us out of it.
No, I'm telling you, man, just visually looking at you now, he had the little beard, he had the full head of dark hair.
Yeah, that's
the dark eyes.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen a picture of him yet or not.
I've seen a lot of pictures. Oh yeah.
Dude, yeah. So you guys, you could be our son, and that's
Glad you're alive.
So we're glad you're alive, right? And we're glad you're doing this, right?
Because there's a lot. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I tried to stay connected to John Leif, and we did all kinds of activity kind of things, but I regret not taking the opportunity to actually talk to him and actually listen to him. So it's the communication. And again, as a parent, we love our kids and we give our lives for them, but you know what? We love imperfectly. Yeah. There's just always something else that we could have done. And,
well, I'd like to say, in talking about the tough love or versus empathy and accountability. We pretty much tried the tough love thing. I knew coming up in from a family that had a lot of enabling, that I saw my mom's side of the family where there was alcoholism, not the Italian side, the English side. And I knew we didn't want to do that. But again, in those early days, there wasn't much public talk about this. The conversations started after the couple of years after he died, especially in where we were in Arizona. And so we didn't engage him. Mm-hmm. And some of the people here in the Rethink Addiction campaign that we've been involved with said, you don't ask why. Don't ask why are you doing this? Because that's not going to open up the conversation. Yeah. But that's what we did. Why are you doing this? We didn't understand that he did not want to be addicted. He didn't want that, but there's guilt, there's shame. But instead, ask, what is it that you're getting from this substance or alcohol? What do you like about it? And how can we help you make changes that will help you work your way out of this? Put less of a punitive approach. We're going to send you away. I mean, that was one of his big fears. You're going to send me away. You're going to send me away. Because we did have a close relationship with him. Mm-hmm. So I just think, some of the books that we went through and the recovery programs that we did do with him, the parents had to be there for certain meetings and group meetings together, which was really good. But Melody Beattie's codependency books were a lot of what, we used in those groups. And really, they would do like situations where you're game playing, role playing, and we were clueless. It's like we were clearly in the codependency section, right? And so the one thing I would say is don't have a young adult with addiction living with you in your home unless they're
over 18.
Right, over 18, unless they're in a verifiable recovery program. Under 18, you have a window of opportunity legally. You can have them, and you can insist they be in a program or whatever. But again, you want to have that communication. And I'm in a couple of online Facebook groups of moms with children who are addicts, 35, 50,000 women. And the stories are painful to read. I can't go on there very often, but it's amazing how many of them are in the complete enabling and codependent circumstances. They'll talk about, my addicted son, just stole my purse today and this and that. And as parents, you are going to enable your kids. They can't be with you when they're in active addiction. That's our strong feeling. So
one little closing thought on the regrets again that I had. I wish that I had realized and had been more sensitive. I guess it's called emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. I was just not clueless, but I just wasn't tuned into the fact that my 12-year-old or my 8-year-old or my 15-year-old son is dealing with a whole lot of stuff. When you're a kid, and particularly in this world, he was fearful and things that I never even considered. Yeah. And so there were a lot of issues, a lot of drivers that kids experience. You're the best example. You can tell exactly what goes on between 12 and 20. And
I didn't talk to anybody. I didn't talk to anybody about that stuff that was happening. Well, that's actually one of the things that Gabor Mate talks about too. Like if you listen to him, that he will ask somebody who says, I had the guy had a perfect childhood, will say, who did you talk to when kind of things were coming up? And invariably, it is, I just didn't talk to anybody, for whatever reason. And again, that's not placing blame here or there. It's just for whatever reason, how that developed, it was all internalized. And I think one of the themes there was that, if you're going through this pain and you're not talking to anybody about it, like there's no kind of, it's going to manifest, somehow. And for John, for me, it, manifested as opiates. You were I can relate too when you were saying that he was, just that fear of like, you're going to send me away. I think I might have even used those same words or some variation of that. When I first got sober, and I was fully abstinent from everything for 5 months. And there was some court stuff going on too. So like there was a reason that I didn't get honest about stuff right away. But I kept that a secret for 9 months because I knew the second that I tell one person, it does not matter who, even if I tell somebody inside this program, it's going to bounce its way back to my wife. It's going to bounce its way back to my parents. That next day, they're going to shuttle me into a place, and I don't want to go there right now. And
exactly. And that relates to, I think, Jeff, a lot of it relates to the drug policies in the United States and the criminalization of people who use drugs. Instead of criminalization, I love the Portugal model that they decriminalized all personal use, but they still prosecute and criminalize the dealers.
Yeah.
But I think also the mentality in the United States about harm reduction, Rhode Island now the first state to approve having a safe injecting room. I mean, they've been in Europe and Australia for a decade or 2 decades, but United States doesn't want to. That looks like we're authorizing people to use drugs instead of knowing that if someone overdoses, they can't recover if they're dead.
Yeah, that feels like a very U.S. thing. I agree. That is it's such a hot topic, harm reduction. I had Jen Elizabeth on the show in episode 2. I'm not sure if you listened to that.
Yes.
She's great. She works for the Sidewalk Project in LA. Just a great advocate for harm reduction. She speaks very well about it. Now speaking personally, I've moved completely from where I was. Like if you interviewed me 10 years ago, about these harm reduction strategies, I would have wrote them all off as enabling and coddling the addicted person, the same kind of stuff that you hear, trading one addiction for another, all that kind of, it's crap is what it is. But like you said, from opioid replacement treatments, from, safe injection sites, clean needles, Narcan availability, basically the understanding that you can't force somebody to give something up if they don't want to, and whether or not you think drugs are bad is not going to stop somebody from using. So this like humane approach, like you're saying, must be to treat the person with care, regardless if they're behaving in the way that you have arbitrarily decided that they should behave. So can you talk a little bit about like harm reduction, how you think overall that we're doing? Because I think we've made some changes in the past few years. It's certainly not wonderful.
Well, I think when the Affordable Care Act took care of some things, whether you like it or not, and there were lots of problems with it, the one thing that it did was get rid of the pre-existing condition thing. And also, like we've been, because we're self-employed, we've been paying for private insurance for decades at around $20,000 a year with our insurance policies and our copay. And they did not cover mental health, which is where drug addiction came under. So when our son ended up in the hospital after his fall, he couldn't say he'd been addicted to opioids because then we would lose insurance coverage. So this backwards health system in the United States is part of the problem. And to not view drug addiction, alcohol addiction as a health problem, I don't care if you think that it's only medical. I don't agree with that. But to not know it once you're addicted is a health problem, that then you have to come up with health solutions, and they have to be covered by health insurance. I mean, government, it should be. So that's a big problem. The US is just, the only first world nation that does not have comprehensive universal coverage. And so I think that's one. We did not understand how vital MAT was for opioid addiction. In particular, his MD psychiatrist, addiction doctor, said to us 6 months before he died that this young man cannot relapse or he will die, because opioid addiction is the cancer of addiction. And he wanted our son to be on Suboxone. And at that point, we were still, he had been on it back when they gave you a ton and it left you just loopy. But we were just done with it. We had took him off our insurance and said, figure it out. You have to want this more. We didn't understand. He wanted it badly. He just watched his friend overdose. So now with Sublocade, the injection, there's so many good options for people. And I'm going to read these statistics again. Opioids are highly addictive, the most addictive substance people can use. 25% of people who try them will become addicted. And from Harvard, John Kelly has said it takes 8 years and 4 to 5 recovery attempts to gain 1 year of recovery from opioids. That's the seriousness.
Well, that's the average. That's what the statistics say. Huh.
That's the statistics. So, and they can permanently change brain chemistry and connections. You've got to view it when we're talking about opioids as a long recovery. You're in it for the long haul.
It's a lifetime.
And so, of course, we feel very strongly about 12-step groups. You've got to have community because, as Johan Hari says, the opposite or the cure for addiction is not sobriety, it's connection and community. So I don't know, we feel very strongly about harm reduction in MAT.
And again, one of our deepest regrets that we made that decision with John Leif in January of 14.
He wanted to be on it though.
Well, he probably knew that he needed to be on it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Like, what was his stance on that drug?
He wanted to be on it.
Yeah.
He did.
But the doctor left the decision with us, and it's the biggest regret we have. Now, of course, people say you don't know if he wouldn't have, cheated on Suboxone or not. Sure, but we didn't give him the chance. Yeah. We didn't give him the chance.
Well, his experience with it was pretty horrible because the earlier physicians were 32 milligrams
a day.
32 milligrams a day, in contrast to 2 or 4 milligrams, which would be more of an appropriate maintenance kind of a dose.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very possible that he'd be doing this interview today instead of you if he had used Suboxone 7 years ago. So.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, personally, I have moved a lot on those drugs. I've taken that stuff. I was never prescribed Suboxone. I can just tell you from my personal experience, and this was in my mid-20s that I would get my hands on it and then I would take it. It never took. I would. This is just my experience. Plenty of people have positive experiences with it. I would take it for a couple of days, for a couple of weeks, and then I would just think, you know what, I'm on this anyway. I want to go do what I really want to do. So, like you said, I guess there is no way to know, but certainly the stigma part of it, we got to get rid of that. This idea of of like, you're not sober if you're taking this, you're trading one addiction for another. That stuff is just
you're
garbage.
Facilitating.
That's and there were many AA and NA groups that he was part of that he couldn't be part of. A recovery program that he went to, I call them, they were the Nazi police up there, the Nazi addiction police. He couldn't even be on clonidine or anything. It was nothing. And he had he was in detox when he went there, and it was like, nothing, you got to do the 12 steps. And, we look back at that and just makes me angry. So I can't talk about it.
It is absolutely in my opinion, the ugliest part of the 12-step groups. Not every group is like that. Not every member, of course. And it's changing a little bit, but yeah, that is there. I know groups on the West Coast, specifically big groups, huge groups that, if you're taking like an SSRI antidepressant, you're not considered sober. They don't want you to be, getting up and picking up your chips. You're not really. Yeah. There's a lot of, I think that stuff was, I wasn't around in the 80s and 90s, but I think that it was a lot worse then in terms of that kind of stuff. Now, just with the overdoses, well, that's kind of like one of my next questions I want to ask you too, is that, so around 2013, 2014, there was some awareness. I knew that this was coming, by the way. I knew as soon as Purdue, I don't want to talk about Purdue Pharmaceutical. I could talk for hours about, I say all the time, like my resentment towards them, I'm not even close to ready to address it. I'm not. And I'm okay with that. I mean, those guys, I think those are just some of the, oh my God, those
criminals.
Well, they're absolute criminals, but even worse. I mean, it's so much deeper than just greed. That there's greed that drives a lot of stuff, and yeah, that's always going to be there with major corporations. But there's just another layer of stuff with those guys, and whenever I just see their faces, still. So anyway, I will say this one point about them: as they were bringing OxyContin to market, and as they were saying, it's not addictive because it's in a time release fashion. And they knew, of course, all you have to do is just crush it with literally anything is going to break that apart. They had the technology to make that tamper resistant at that point. They held on to that the entire time until they finally lost patent. Once that drug lost patent, it was 2009 going into 2010.
Yeah.
So I was working on the pharmacy bench at this time too. And I saw, and people, it was insane the way people were dealing with this drug and trying to get this drug. And I worked at a whole lot of different pharmacies, different areas. It did not matter. The poorest, I worked in some of the wealthiest areas in Santa Monica and Pacific Palisades and Beverly Hills. Same thing across the board. I knew that once that drug, because you couldn't do anything with those new ones except swallow it whole, which these people weren't doing anyway. I knew that at that point, there was going to instantly be this gigantic heroin explosion. Now, I didn't predict fentanyl, of course, but it was only going to be, and usually just a couple years later, like you said, just like how long it takes some of this stuff to manifest. There was no doubt in my mind that a couple years later it was going to start exploding. The whole fentanyl thing just kind of plays back into like safe supply. That's a pretty big issue that some people have a problem with it. I mean, certainly if we knew what somebody was getting and you get this in those safe injection sites, there's no way that wouldn't immediately bring down some of those, just this like gigantic number. In your opinion, like, why do you think, just with all the resources and all the attention and all the public health initiatives, why do you think that overdose number continues to rise year after year?
Well, I think it's lack of information, and I still think stigma is the big one, because stigma keeps drug abuse in the shadows. And that's what we always say, is that we want to take it out of the shadows and shine a light on it. And I think every story that comes out and everybody that speaks out helps show that, yeah, our son wasn't a Skid Row person. Not that somebody on Skid Row is any less of a person, but there's a way in which people marginalize and people who are dismiss people who are poor. They think that they want to be that way. And I think that you
don't like to tell people your kid's a heroin addict.
Right.
I'm sure your parents probably, I don't know how much they knew about what you were doing through that era, but it's just the kind of thing that doesn't go over well at parties.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's a natural, like, ugh, that's terrible.
Yeah, that's somebody else's kid, not mine. And
the high school, they wouldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
So I think the educating the public, letting them know the war on drugs never worked. It failed. It failed miserably. You don't make a war on a inanimate object. All it did was help stigmatize. And so I think the drug policy and laws need to change. I mean, the overdose deaths are going to continue now. Like you said, we've got fentanyl coming in. It's sent in the mail from China. It's going in masses amounts to Mexico, where they're mixing it with every drug, even drugs that aren't drugs of abuse. So you never know. Here in Australia, they do pill testing at their festivals. That it's a very common place for kids young high schoolers to use drugs. And so you can get your individual pill tested without any police involvement or whatever. You can come into the festival, get it tested. but the addiction people that we've spoken with here said they like the idea of general testing, the batch testing for drugs. So say you bought your bag of heroin so that you can test if your heroin before you use it has been laced with fentanyl, carfentanil, or ketamine, whatever. So,
well, I think another factor that goes into the reason opiate addiction is still an issue, and it's an increasing addiction, was close to 100,000 last year in America alone, and then there's the worldwide, is the continual fragmentation of our society. We, in America in particular, I think it's true here, maybe less so in Australia. Kids are, you know, a large part, they're not normally a part of a huge family community. Now, maybe as an Italian family, you had that. We had a great family experience, you know, issues, of course, but we were connected to each other. But there wasn't this larger neighborhood, everybody's aunt and uncle is watching everybody else's cousin and such. That just doesn't happen anymore in America. So there's this fragmentation and lack of community. And I think it's a big factor.
I know, Jeff, you're big into nutrition and stuff. And something that we did a couple of interviews and podcasts here in Australia. And I say to parents is that think of the things that boost the natural chemicals that drugs are supplying for teenagers. Because as your brain is developing, and dopamine and endorphins, and they go up and down, and as we all remember, being teenagers are very emotional times, and you've got that all going on. I really feel that a way we failed our children was we did not engage them in any kind of community service. Our kids had a good sleep routine, they had a good diet, and John and I were involved in a community service as adults, but it wasn't something our kids could be part of because it was our thing. And I view that as one of the biggest mistakes, because the joy of giving to others sacrificially to people that cannot pay you back produces so many positive brain chemicals. It's almost off the charts. It's well known. And that was in previous generations. It was how the family on the farm or in a close-knit neighborhood, when somebody's house burned down or somebody got sick, everybody joined together to give and to serve. And there are plenty of places that families can do this nowadays. There's so much need in our society. And I just think we're too focused on athletics and entertainment. And that's great. It's good to be athletic and stuff, but a lot of it is very self-serving, and you don't reap any benefits emotionally from that. And I feel very strong about that.
I mean, I completely agree with all that. You know, just in terms of that community attachment piece, I agree. You know, that largely a lot of that is missing. And just in terms of, and I can speak from experience, because so after reading, you know, a few of these books, especially the Hold On to Your Kids, that kind of stuff, as I learned about like attachment theory, well, now my eyes are open to it. And I can't not see it anymore, whereas I could not see it before. And I will tell you that just that piece of like, you know, the other people, everybody kind of like raising the kids, so to speak, like the village to raise the child.
Right.
So many parents today, from my perspective anyway, are ultra sensitive to saying anything to anybody else's kids, and you don't want to upset the parent, and I don't want to make this person, you know, should I not say this to this one? Everybody kind of keeps quiet, but you can't hide how you're feeling about a situation, you know. So I hear, and I've heard these guys like describe it. I would not do it justice to try to articulate it, but just the fact that if you're not actively trying to kind of parent this or sort of helping maybe like raise this child, you are doing the opposite, because you're feeling like something should be done, but you're not actually doing it. So the child is picking up on that energy, but they don't know why. So all that they know is that they're not connecting with this person. They don't understand that it's because maybe there's something that needs to be said that maybe isn't being said.
Exactly.
Great point.
You had a quote that I read, and you said, we can't treat our way out of the opioid epidemic. We have to focus on prevention. Prevention strategies have been notoriously and comically ineffective. I mean, if you want to kind of go back just in the last 20, 25 years, some of the stuff that we do, what are some strategies that you think, might actually work? Like things that maybe schools should employ, even things for, for young parents, kind of stuff for me, right? Because I mean, I have these two little kids, certainly, in terms of a genetic predisposition, that could have certainly gotten passed on to them. What are some things that you see?
Well, I think again, it's know your family genetics. I always say shake the family tree and see what's hiding under the leaves, and know that is a risk factor. Alcoholism, drug abuse, be careful about who your kids become friends with, know their families, be involved with, schools and communities. So I think everything we've talked about
we touched on a lot of that already.
We are in a different world. One of the things we did with JL was that John remembers going from Minnesota to LA as a 12-year-old and riding his bike around, downtown LA. It was a different world, but he had lots of freedom, but there weren't the dangers. And we feel that we gave our child too much freedom too early on, too much unsupervised time with peers, parties. I look back now and think, what were we thinking? And so, again, it was rather than kids have time, they need to be involved, but are they involved just to party? There's got to be more to life than that. So I think that, and the education, I think that's really our desire is to speak out and to educate people so nobody has to experience what we experienced, because the grief that we suffered and lived with was something we've never experienced in our life. I had a younger brother die from AIDS. Another younger brother died from suicide. A sister died from breast to brain cancer. And we've had parents die. Nothing is like the death of your own child, and especially a preventable death. So that's what we want to help see is educating.
It has to stop.
Yeah.
It just has to stop.
What do you recommend for the grief piece to, like we said, in the US alone, 93,000, deaths this year. That's 93,000, potential parents or family members. What is that process? What kind of stuff could you recommend to a family who's going through the unimaginable situation that might feel like there's never any other side to it at this point in their lives?
A one-liner that I will say to start this is the only cure for grief is to grieve. Denying it, minimizing it, none of that is a cure. The cure is to go through it. It is a process.
When John Leif died, to me, I couldn't actually conceive of the fact that time itself was continuing to progress and that he was no longer in it. Jude and I dealt with our grief in very different ways. She studied the Kubler-Ross 5 stages, and the only thing that I gathered out of that is that yes, you do go through all the anger and the denial and the bargaining and the depression and all. I gathered that it's not a linear process. You kind of bounce around in that process. So as long as you're committed to going through this and facing it, don't be concerned about how it happens, because I've said this to a lot of times something tragic like this happens and some well-intentioned friend will come up and say, "Oh, bro, you just need to do it this way." And I'm going, "Well, thanks. Yeah, that's good."
Or
but
don't be sad.
Right.
Don't be sad. if you just look ahead, you'll be happy.
So,
and you get all those kind of comments.
My conclusion there was that there isn't a right way to grieve. There's your way to grieve. So for me, I looked at all the pictures. I listened to all of JL's music. He'd given me a CD with Bone Thugs and Harmony, Crossroads on it. And I mean, just, and I would spend my time
Great
crying.
album.
Yeah, it is a great album. Exactly. So I would spend my time just crying. And I was so thrilled. One of the things that just really was medicine for both of us was this connection to his good friends and how they would come out of the woodwork and they'd FaceTime us 10 months later and say, you don't even know me, but John Leif was like a huge part of my life in a positive way.
Yeah, hearing good. And I will say the reason we heard good things, and not to toot our own horn, but the first thing we did was the day he died, that afternoon, we posted on his Facebook, his sister posted in Australia, JL died this morning of a heroin overdose. And we made it clear from day one, because I firmly believe that if you feel shame and you're ashamed, then you shame the person. And we were not going to shame him. He was not a bad person.
I agree with that.
We made it very clear. We took 10 days while Johanna flew from Australia, cousins flew in, friends flew in from the country, all over the country. We took 10 days. Everybody camped out at the house. They worked on a beautiful 12-minute memorial video that we've posted on Facebook. They scanned photos out of photo albums from the last 20, 30 years. And we took the time to do it the way we wanted to do it and to make this a way to remember his life. And then
that ended up in a beautiful memorial service, which I think is very important because it's part of the rituals that you need to go through after a death, any death, but particularly for your own child.
Right, because mourning is the external acts we do to when have a loss. Grief is the internal, the feelings. Those you have no control over, and those are the steps you have to go through.
So we had
I like that distinction.
200 folks show up at his memorial, and 50, 60 of them were kids from his various crews. He had the jock crew and the intellectual crew and the debate crew and the cocaine crew and the alcohol crew and the heroin crew. So these kids, stood over his casket for the afternoon and cried and went out and took a smoke and came back and cried some more. And they tolerated then 2 hours worth of lots of sharing, including a message of hope. So those things are really, really critical. And I'll stop by saying Jude didn't really want to talk. She didn't really want to go there. She didn't want to look at the pictures. She didn't want to, deal with the things in his room or things of that nature right away. Now, eventually, of course, she did. Those things are part of that process.
Well,
for me, I couldn't stop talking about it. And here's the interesting thing: when this happens, to this very day, we have a new conversation with a new couple that we meet here in Cabarita Beach, and they're great folks. And they say, "Well, how about your kids?" We had 2 kids, one surviving, and our son died of a heroin overdose in 2014 at 25. Oh my gosh, everybody we talk to has got a story.
Wow.
So it's just, and again, for me, that's part of the recovery for me, part of the healing, I guess is what you call it.
Well, what happens is you invite other people in. Yeah. So it's, instead of it being the white elephant in the living room, it's inviting people to talk. And I think that's what happened with his friends when, we did a memorial dinner afterwards for everybody. And then after that, we started we got kids' phone numbers and kept texting. And then on the year anniversary of his death, we did a remembrance gathering at our house and had a bunch of them came. And by that time we'd sorted through all of his stuff. And so we made a fun part where we gave away his beer glasses and his
shot glasses
and his throwing stars and his knives and all the stuff that his sister didn't want, t-shirts. Yeah. And then we had sharing time and lots of tears. And you give people that opportunity to talk. and to be in a safe place where they can express the things that they want to express and their feelings, that they have no other platform or venue to do it in. And
because they suffered loss as well.
right.
There were a handful of very close friends who JL contacted in that June before he died. And for one reason or another, they couldn't get back together with them. They couldn't follow up. So they had a lot of regrets.
Right.
And it was just a good healing process.
Right. And you don't, so that really helps, again, get rid of that stigma and shame. And then we had a 5-year gathering 2 years ago, and that's probably the last time we'll do it. Maybe we'll do a 10-year, but you invite people in. And like John said, yeah, I'm definitely the introvert. I'm a social introvert. I can talk your ear off when it's the time, but my way of processing was more to write. And we did Opiate Nation, our book, which you want me to show a picture of it there?
Please, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so there's Opiate Nation.
Hold up. Yeah, very good. Okay.
Yeah. Came from the fact that the day JL died, we started a journal. And I've always journaled. John has irregularly written things, but we started a journal together, and we wrote how it just came out was we started writing to JL. And so we'd just do entries, each of us, whatever we felt. Sometimes it was 1 line, sometimes it was 2 pages, but because it was our way of documenting our grief, it really helped us process. And there are tons of articles and books about how writing is the way to process our emotions. And so again, for me, it was, I just felt I was tired. Grief is very fatiguing. And if you're an introvert, talking is fatiguing. For John, as an extrovert, talking is how he gets his energy. So the kid at the car wash, like, he goes, "How are you doing? You're not taking drugs, are you? My son just died of an overdose." Don't the kids go, "Who is this maniac?" You know. So we each have our own way.
Yeah.
And my way was certainly more to talk with my close friends, more safe places, and John's was to be out there. But whatever way you do it, you need to do it. And closure, people would always say, "Well, I just hope you find closure soon." You don't find closure. That's a business transaction. There's no closure on grief. What you look for is acceptance, accepting the fact that this happened. You're not okay with it. It's not right, but it is what happened. And you find a way to integrate the person into your life in a new way. And you find meaning. You look for ways to find meaning. And part of that is celebrating their life and saying, this person was a great person. They had all these qualities and they did not want to be addicted. And so that is very important. And one last thing I'm going to say about grief, and on our blog at opiatenation.com, from January 1st, 2018, you can look it up. It's called Grieving the Living. And a psychologist in California wrote this. And if you have somebody in active addiction, there is also grief, because you've lost the Jeff that you knew as your son when he was clear-eyed and a wonderful person that you could relate to and you could trust. Your wife loses the husband that she had come to know and married. And so there's a way in which for people who live with active addiction, that you do have to change your relationship and your expectation. And I think had we known that, those expectations we had of our son would have come down a couple notches and we would have been more compassionate. And so I think grieving the living is an aspect of grief that we have to remind people of, because what is it that they think? There's 20 million people in active addiction in the United States at this point. I mean, it's big.
Yeah.
And so for us, our heart is now to be a part of the solution. Anything we can do, any way, any retelling of JL's story or of our story that can help one family. Jude poured her heart and soul into Opiate Nation. If it's helped one family, it's been worth the expense, and it's been worth the time and the effort and the labor.
And that's our part, is that's, like I said, we will not treat our way out of the opioid epidemic. We need treatments, we need medication, we need all that, but that's throwing it at the back end. Prevention is what we need. That's our part. That's the place that we can play.
There's a program here that Jude's attached to some professors at one of the large universities.
Addiction.
Yeah, and they've titled it Rethink Addiction. And it's just the whole big picture of how we can change public mindset, how we can change governmental policy, how we can change recovery programs. What is it? How are we going to fix this?
Well, that was going to be one of my last questions, actually, is what can people do at the grassroots level, which I think that you've been touching on. As you were just answering that question just now, I am looking at you guys thinking, like, what the addiction world is so fortunate to have people like you, people that have been through this experience and that have that kind of perspective, because I just imagine that everybody goes through it differently, but not everybody kind of comes out to the point where they can actually now use that experience that no doubt in my mind that you're helping so many people. I mean, look, like you said, if you could help just one person, you helped me today. I mean, I'm sitting here, for the last hour or whatever, listening to you guys and really getting so much from this conversation. And I know, once I, once this goes up, that a lot of other people are going to hear this as well. John and Judy, thank you guys so much for your time today. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. You kind of held up Opiate Nation there. You want to just kind of tell people like how they can get in contact with you, how they can get the book? Yeah, I know it's on Amazon.
Yeah, and I'm sorry about the pricing issues. I could just say we put with the distributor that we wanted it to be sold at cost. They won't let you sell it at a loss, which we wouldn't mind anyway. But and it was supposed to be, the ebook and the paperback were supposed to be on sale for this 10 days around International Overdose Awareness Day. And one area it went up, another place it went down. Anyway, just keep looking. There's you can order it from your local bookstores or Amazon book distributory.
The website is just simply opiatenation.com.
Right, and on there, yeah, that gets you to the blog. That gets you. There's a contact page. I respond to all emails. Anything we can do to help support people. I've been doing the blog for 4 years now, so there's lots of topical and interviews. And last year I went through the 30 chapters of Opiate Nation for each blog. So they're about a 3-minute read. And I did each chapter, just a thought on it. And so there's probably places where people can find some information and then, go from there.
And you'll find her Instagram account, and she's Twitter and Facebook and all that stuff as well. So
same name, Opiate Nation? Yep.
Well, Instagram is my name, Jude Trang, but you can find it. If you go to Opiate Nation, you'll find all the links.
All right, very good. Well, to both of you guys, I appreciate your willingness to talk about this topic, talk about like your own personal experience openly, which of course helps you process through the grief yourself, but also just provides hope and guidance to millions of families that have experiences with addictions, as we all just struggle to know what the best thing to do is in any given situation. So thanks again, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah. And Jeff, thank you so much for having us. Really appreciate it.
And for your effort and work. Yep, we really appreciate it.
Thank you guys. Talk soon.
Bye.